Hi, Doug. How are you today?
I'm good, Aubrey. It's so good to see you as always. I so enjoy our China conversations and just the interactive dialogue around these things. So I'm thrilled to see you and thankful for your friendship and partnership. And I'm ready to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. So, last week we talked about the delay of Trump's visit to China and we talked about Tim Cook's visit to China. There's continually, ebbing and flowing, as we know, in the global politics. Anything that's come up in the past week related to Trump's visit to China or even what we've learned after Tim Cook visited China?
Well, yeah, and thank you for that question, just because um, this is a really important time. I mean, I say this over and over again, but I think we're at the most important time in U.S. China relations in many decades. And as you and I have discussed, it seemed like things were on a better track. We went going back over about 14 months ago. We had, the beginning of the trade war and Trump's new administration, and things looked like they were just going to get worse and worse with tit for tat trade and tariff issues. And then things looked much better in September of 2025 because of the meeting in South Korea and the fact that Trump referred to it as the G2 meeting, implying to Xi Jinping and to people in China that, the United States and China are the G2, the two countries that are the most powerful economies in the world. We're running the world. And so, this was, I think, a really powerful statement for China and powerful statement for Chairman Xi. And then this next meeting, which was supposed to happen March 30th to April 3rd, was seen in China as a continuation of that type of dialogue where Chairman Xi and President Trump would be meeting and really kind of thinking of themselves as the G2, the two nations that were the most powerful economies running the world. And then, of course, as you and I have discussed in previous episodes, the war in Iran has altered things because, the Trump administration wasn't focused on preparing for the meeting and eventually called for a 5-week delay of the meeting. And so that was, I think, very frustrating to people in China and very frustrating to the administration. And there have been interesting dynamics that have emerged around that. For example, Chairman Xi and his administration have just launched 2 trade probes against the United States. And, these things are usually largely symbolic because, so the United States has done trade probes against China on its green energy and the ways in which it's, using labor in its industries and, whether or not this should lead to more tariffs in certain areas. But China's sort of hitting back and saying, well, we can launch trade probes against the United States too. And so that's what we're going to do. And so it's a sad moment, I think, because I thought we were sort of climbing out of this really difficult tit for tat and kind of really building into a partnership. And I think people in China thought that, but it looks like now we're sort of spiraling back down into to this kind of dynamic. Hopefully, in 5 weeks, there will be a meeting and it'll be much more sort of built around partnership and sort of the G2ism idea. But right now, things look tense, and so an issue. There's another issue that is related to issues that we've discussed before, but as you know, the Taiwan issue and the ways in which Taiwan is thought of, Taiwan, in China's view, is fundamentally a part of China. The United States has affirmed that view for the last 4 decades. The very idea of one country, 2 systems sort of affirms the idea that, yes, Taiwan is a different kind of political system and has its own economy, but it's a part of China, and there's no negotiation over that. And then, of course, when we discussed this a couple of weeks ago, things had gotten tense because of some comments that the Japanese prime minister made about the tensions and, the idea that, any from China directed across the Taiwan Strait is unacceptable. And, we need to really kind of think seriously about where this is going. And, again, this is a very, very, I don't want to use the word dangerous lightly, but it's a very, very tense issue because in China, this issue is non-negotiable. Taiwan is part of China. And yes, it's a different political system and has its own independent economy, but it is a part of China. There is no discussion and no way to talk about Taiwan independence. Now, the reason that this comes up in terms of current events right now is several U.S. lawmakers have announced that they're going to go visit Taiwan within the next couple of weeks. And, that has happened before. We have U.S. lawmakers who have gotten on planes and flown into Taipei. But the idea that right before this meeting with Chairman Xi, 5 or 6 U.S. lawmakers are going to be flying to Taiwan to visit the government there. It's just a little bit tense. And so that's the other issue that's sort of been on my mind in terms of thinking about where things are going, what we need to be careful about and what we need to think about in terms of U.S. China relations and the important dynamics of U.S. China relations.
Right, and there's a lot there. Um, when you were saying, on the right track, I was imagining, horses on a racetrack together and,
Right.
they're either, kind of neck and neck. One is just like a nose ahead. But, now there feels like maybe there's a little bit more aggression where,
Right.
one may, try to pull ahead. And, rather than having, like a partnership where, the US and China are sort of pushing each other competitively. If you've ever been a runner, which I think you are, when you're racing, it really helps to have somebody pushing right behind you. And if China and the US are doing that for each other, that's great because both economies will grow. But if there's this tension there, one is going to continue to overtake the other. And whether it's the US or China, I think kind of remains to be seen.
And I love the fact that you used initially. I love the metaphor, but you used the word partnership. Like what I had been really hoping with the G2 meeting in September of 2025 was that we were going to move in this direction of partnership, where
Mhm.
we're really kind of thinking through, if something is going to happen in the world, like say the Strait of Hormuz and you know, the situation in Iran, like, in my opinion, it would be much healthier if we were treating China as partner because as I've often said to you, in terms of our economies, we're married to China. There is no plan B. It's not the fact that Foxconn has built a factory in Chennai and so therefore iPhones can be made in India. That's ridiculous. I mean, yes, Foxconn has a plant in Chennai, but Apple works with over 1,600 Chinese suppliers. The fact that it has this huge network of suppliers is what allows it to be so efficient and allows it to be, to have such good profit margins because they're constantly negotiating with many different suppliers on how to build their components, modules, and final assembly. And Apple's just one example. Tesla, Walmart, as we've discussed before, is the single largest exporter from China to the United States. And so we're so deeply embedded with China that this is not going anywhere. And so therefore, I think we need to be thinking about partnership more than
Right.
thinking about competition. Like partnership is the word. And so to your race analogy, like when you have two people that are sort of running together, but they're kind of pushing each other along and breaking wind for each other, that's great. But if we're moving back towards more of a competitive kind of enemy stance, it's not healthy. And so
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the caution necessary with the issue of Taiwan, um, curious about how this will play out, but this is definitely a signal, intended or not, by the US delegation that's heading over there. Intentions aside, it will seems to be very much will be viewed as adversarial by the Chinese central government for sure in advance of those conversations, which will just make everything more difficult. I do also, I guess being that the year of the horse is in China right now, I guess my initial horse racing analogy was accidentally appropriate.
look at you.
Um,
Yes, I love that.
so, this is an interesting time. Hopefully, as you've mentioned, both economies are tied to one another. So anything that one does will impact the other. And so China obviously wants to protect its economy here, as well as, the United States wanting to protect its economy. I can't imagine any major shifts as anything would be, initially devastating. So I want to talk about the historical writing that comes into play now. So 100 years ago, Bertrand Russell wrote that, China's economy would rise. And we're sort of living in that moment right now. And I'm wondering what that sort of feels like to you as somebody who is a scholar writing on this moment and also looking back in order to look forward. This feels like a really important piece to reflect on. Our OGL team has written on Bertrand Russell's work and in light of the current economic rise of China. Just curious to hear your thoughts on it and wanted to hear more.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question, and my China team really took the lead on pushing us to write about this issue. And I was so impressed that they brought it up. One of the things, just to put this in context for, again, what the OGL philosophy is on how to analyze China. So we have sort of two pieces that are closely tied to sort of what my, academic mindset is. One is we love boots on the ground approaches to things, right? And so we think of ourselves as economists and analysts of what's going on. But, I also really emphasize, and our team really believes in a sort of ethnographic and anthropological approach in addition to the economics and sociological approaches. And that means that you can't really understand what's going on in a complex society unless you are out talking to people and out really doing sort of the ethnographic work that sandwiches with or mirrors the economic work, right? And so that's one of our core philosophies, and it's why OGL always frames itself as a boots on the ground organization, because we believe in being out there, and we have a team in China, and I get to China as often as I can. And so this is really important for our philosophy. There's a second part to it, though. When I fell in love with Chinese language, literature, and history, and, really kind of came up as a young scholar, an undergraduate student at the University of Chicago before I went on to do my doctoral work at Berkeley, I also really fell in love with the idea of history and culture. I just don't, again, you can be a good economist and you can read State Statistical Bureau data, but if you're not out talking to people and you're not deeply knowledgeable about the history and culture, you're just not going to understand what's going on. And so we try to write about those kinds of issues as often as possible. And one of the team members in China said, Doug, we should really write something about Bertrand Russell. And it was really interesting for me because I've, as somebody who was trained as a historian of China many years ago, known about Bertrand Russell's work and had read it many years ago, but I just hadn't thought about it in a long time. And so that the China team really pushed for this was really impressive in my view. And it's a really interesting time for this because, as you mentioned, so Russell visited China in 1922. So he was a British philosopher, and he went to China to do lectures for about a year in 1922. So this is over 100 years ago, right? And it's a time when China was in peril, right? And so, we've talked about some of this history on our podcast, but just to be very brief, for 2,000 years, from about 500 BCE to about 1400. I always mark 1424 as kind of the key transition year. China was the most powerful and innovative economy in the world. China was the economy that was so much more powerful than any economy in Europe. It was the most innovative economy. A lot of the things that we credit Europe for, like paper and the printing press, those are not Gutenberg German inventions. Those are Chinese inventions, and they came to China from the Silk Road. Similarly, the nautical compass, which was used by a lot of Western countries to go colonize the world. Similarly, gunpowder, which was, these are all Chinese inventions. And in 1424, Yongle died, and he was the third Ming emperor. There was sort of a battle within the Chinese imperial court, and the Confucian scholarly elite didn't want to go out and colonize the world. They wanted China to be just a holistic culture. And so they actually started to look inward, built the Great Wall. And then, for the next several hundred years, there's just crises because there was, the European world was going out and colonizing the world, and they were doing things like selling drugs, like opium. And then there was the Opium Wars of 1839 and 1842. And then there was the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. And then there was the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. China, and then there was the warlord period, which was just chaos. And so China was just in a really, 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 really difficult period in the 1990s. And so it's just interesting that Bertrand Russell goes and visits China in 1922 and is giving lectures, and China's sort of, just in this mess of having, had all of these terrible wars and the fall of the imperial dynasty and the warlord period. And this was around the time of the founding of the Communist Party as well. But Russell saw something that no other scholars were seeing. He saw that, he famously said, in the book, China, by her resources and her population, is capable of being the greatest power in the world besides the United States. And again, this was 1922. Like, this was a time of real chaos in China. And, you know, so my China team was like, Doug, we should be writing about this because, you know, it's an interesting thing that 100 years ago, Bertrand Russell was seeing something, and China has now grown to be, you know, the second largest economy in the world. And our OGL team believes that in about the next 6 or 7 years, China will surpass the United States as the largest economy in the world. And, you know, it's a much more powerful economy. I mean, we've talked about this with respect to tariffs and the trade war issues, but you know, tariffs are not going to rebuild the manufacturing supply chain in America, right? It will take us decades and decades to build something as powerful as China's manufacturing supply chain. And so it's a really interesting just reflection. And, you know, I'll pause right there because I'm talking a lot, but Russell does have a couple of key areas that he was focused on. So any thoughts on my long-winded answer?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially the title of his book was the problem of China, as
Right.
if, this growing economy is a problem for the rest of the world. And we can see a lot of benefits over the last 100 years of China's economy having grown over that time period. Everything that we do, I think, in the United States is impacted by, and supported by China's economy. What I also think is interesting is so I guess maybe I want to talk about that, like the title itself, the problem of China, because I do think we've seen a lot of benefits globally. But I also want to kind of contrast that the thesis of the book is that China, if they were to establish an orderly government, develop industry, and popularize education, that their economy will grow. And contrasting that to the current United States economy, an orderly government. I don't think we have this right now. I would not classify our government as orderly. We have developed industry, but we've outsourced a lot of it, which is sort of where the challenge is. But we've developed these industrial networks that are challenged by the current administration and tariffs and popularizing education. I think we've seen that over and over again, like the United States education system is faltering, crumbling. It's not nearly as strong as it could be. So I see some bellwethers of this. Yes, China is growing, but yes, also the United States is perhaps not doing what it can to continue to grow its economy and maybe making decisions that are harming our economy. So curious about your thoughts on the title of The Problem of China and what you think about that.
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and it's an important thing for the book because it's sort of a double entendre issue. Because you know, China was in crisis when Russell was visiting, and you know, so this was 1922, and so he's looking at the warlord period and the chaos that's happening. You know, it was right around the time of the founding of the CPC, Chinese Party, the Communist Party of China. But the problem of China was also that, hey guys, it was sort of a wake up call to the world. Like, we better focus on what's happening here because, if I'm right, and, he would pass away long before this would happen, but, China was going to rise to be the most powerful nation and economy in the world besides the United States. So when we're in this G2 moment, it's interesting that he was talking about like China and the United States, back 104 years ago. And so the problem of China was really, I mean, this was one of these brilliant books because of the timing in which it was written and sort of the deep insight that still resonates today. But he was really kind of thinking deeply about, like, how are we going to deal with this as this occurs? Now, one of the things that's important to also remember here is, and we talk about this in OGL a lot, China still had a long period to go through to really get through. I mean, the quote unquote century of humiliation lasts about from 1839 to 1949. And so this was still an early period where China was in chaos. And then we see the rise of the Communist Party and we see the communist revolution. So, China was still had a war to fight in the 1940s from about 1945 to 1949. And it was a war between the nationalists and the communists. And eventually the nationalists lost the war and went to live on the island of Taiwan, which is sort of where, some of the Taiwan tensions that we were talking about earlier began. But, again, the problem of China was really this just interesting, deep, insightful thing to think about. And, it's just nice resonance for what we were just talking about in our current events discussion, because, in my view, the United States needs to think about China as a partner. If we kind of continue to build tensions and continue to disrespect, it's going to hurt our economy and it's going to hurt the global economy. When often say we are married to China, companies like Apple, Tesla, Walmart, and many others can't exist without China right now. And so, like, we've got to really figure out ways to treat the Chinese government as the G2 partner, right? And so it's a great. I love that you're calling out the title of the book because it was such an insightful book over 100 years ago. I mean, we're living it today.
Right. And, I don't know enough about, the global economy in 1922, but I would imagine that China was not in the top 5 of large economies. So the fact that Russell was calling this out at that point was especially thoughtful,
Yeah.
and it's as if he had a crystal ball. So, yeah, I think this is really, really interesting and, timely for our team to be reflecting and to be working on this. Do you have any other thoughts on how looking back in history helps us understand present day?
Sure. Again, Russell sort of breaks this down. You mentioned these points, but he talks about government, industry, education, and culture. And, as we were discussing at the very beginning of our talk, my team really believes in the idea that you need to think deeply about culture and you need to think deeply about history. And so the history over the last 104 years since Russell published his book is really important because, first there was the warlord period and, the fall of the Qing dynasty. And so, it was a really crisis oriented time for China, and China still had a lot to go through before it would start the path to becoming a powerful economy. We have the Communist Revolution, and then we have Mao's China and the Cultural Revolution from 1949 to Mao passed away in 1976. And then we have somebody come to power in 1978, and his name is Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping was a really interesting character. I often tell this leadership story about Deng Xiaoping. In 1926, when Deng Xiaoping was 16 years old, he wanted to get on in steerage on a boat and go visit Europe. And Deng Xiaoping's father said, "Why would you want to go visit Europe? Like, what does Europe have?" And Deng Xiaoping, who was a kid, and I often tell this story in my China classes, but I also love to tell this story in my leadership classes because he said, "Well, Dad, I want to go to Europe and learn what we can about economics so I can come back and save China." And just like, think about that, like a 16-year-old kid who was sort of hunkering down in Southwest China because, there was the chaos of the warlord period and the rise of the Communist Revolution. He was saying, and he did. His father lent him the money and he went to France and then to Moscow and, came back. And then when Chairman Mao passed away, Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978. And then 1979, he got on a plane and flew to visit Jimmy Carter. And they shook hands and agreed that they needed to be open to each other economically. And then you see basically the rise of China in the 1980s and 1990s. And, there was not just Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping, but then there was also the Clinton administration and, Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin. And then there's China's entry into the WTO in 2001. And then there's Apple's entry into China in 2001. So we just see this historical period. Of course, then we see the rise of Chairman Xi in 2013 and things get a little more tense in terms of how we were thinking about how companies like Apple and Tesla and Walmart could operate in China, but they've been fine. And, I've been part of some of those conversations because I was helping Apple during that time period. So again, just to sort of pile on to your issue of like, how history matters. History isn't just like the deep history of 1922 to 1949. This is also the period of 1949 to 1979 and 1979 to 2013 and 2013 to today. So there's a lot of interesting and important history here. Our team just likes to make sure that people recognize some of that history because all of these things come in these layers. And so like when we're in this moment of China wanting to be respected and being treated like, the G2. Remember, I think we've said this for our teams before, but the G2 issue is so important because, there's the G7, which is the group of 7 nations, which is the United States, Canada, and 5 European nations. And then there's the kids table, which is developing countries, and they're the G20. And you can be at the kids' table, China and India, but you can't be in the G7. We're not going to create a G8 or a G9. And people in China find this very offensive because, people in China are like, we're the second largest economy in the world. How come we're not we're not at the adults table? And so then President Trump meeting Chairman Xi and calling this the G2 is sort of a signal of like, we are the most important nations in the world in terms of economics. We are it. And so people in China really respected that and were thankful about that. And again, as we were saying at the beginning of this call, of this meeting, this meeting in March, April was supposed to be a continuation of that conversation. And so now that things have gotten tense again, I think we're losing that. So again, this is just a long history, but it's an important history.
Yeah. And even when, I look at, the timeline of U.S. China relations, I was born in 1979. So there's a lot that's, that has happened since I was born to now. The things that I find interesting, the relationship as, at the beginning, it's sort of like trading something back and forth, right? And then eventually we are to the point where we are now, where we have woven together. And as you say, like, we are deeply enmeshed. We're married, but the visual that comes to mind for me is, fabric that is woven together. And if we try to pull these two economies apart, it's just going to rip things into shreds. And so I think having the awareness of that enmeshment, and, it's almost like more than a marriage. I see it as fabric woven together that you absolutely cannot separate it without a lot of damage, frayed edges, and catastrophe. So I think we do need to be very cognizant and cautious as we do proceed with intention with these relationships. And, I think each economy needs to, take care of its own people, but also realize that taking care of the partnership is taking care of its own people. And I think that's why the work you do with your clients is so important, because you can help them understand the intricacies of the relationship building that happens on both continents.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I mean, you said it brilliantly. I think that, again, we are so fundamentally intertwined that, you know, both of our economies are deeply dependent on each other, right? And they're dependent on each other in ways that, a simple trade war or tariff war cannot solve. Because, part of the reason companies like Apple are the most profitable and most valuable companies in the world is because of how deeply embedded in the manufacturing supply chain they are in China. The same with Tesla. Even though Tesla has a gigafactory that's more vertically integrated than the Apple factories, they still rely on lots of Chinese suppliers. And we learn things about how to build batteries for electric vehicles, and we learn things about how to use the different kinds of technology in the manufacturing supply chain. And so, yes, there are other big countries like India, which is the population has just surpassed China in population, but it will take decades to build the manufacturing supply chain there that China has built over the last 4 decades. And we don't have that manufacturing supply chain in the United States. And so, we are married. There is no pulling apart. And so we just need to be respectful about that and sort of think very carefully about just how deeply embedded we are and treat each other like partners, right? And so I think that that's a really important, I talk about Apple often and talk about Tesla often, but I've had some other smaller clients that are doing really interesting things that are about education in the manufacturing supply chain and about sustainability. And, again, so there's just a lot of opportunity for both sides on this, but we need to be respectful and treat each other like partners, right? And so that's just, I think, a really important piece.
Right. Well, there's always a lot happening, it seems, always a lot to talk about week to week. The world is shifting as global politics continues to do its thing. So in addition to government and industry, Russell also talks a lot about education and culture. How do you think that played into the rise of China over the last 100 years?
So it's a great question, Aubrey, because, typically I think in the United States, and being an academic and an educator myself, we think of the U.S. higher education system as the most powerful in the world. And are among the leading voices in higher education and things like, all of the things that feed into Silicon Valley and innovation. And for a long time, a lot of Chinese students wanted to come to the United States to really kind of, they would go through their higher education system and take the what's called the Gaokao, which is the high level test, and go into university in China, and then come get their master's degrees or PhDs in the United States. And it was a great. So this is one of the things that worries me so much about the trade war and tariff war, because there's a lot of visa issues that are coming up here. So the U.S. is still a very powerful place in terms of higher education. But we also, one of the things that Russell called out and predicted was China's emphasis on education would be really important. And so, it's been fascinating that in 1949, when Mao took power, the illiteracy rate was about 80%. And so, it was very clear that there were a lot of issues and tensions over education in China. That illiteracy rate has dropped to under 3% in China. It's a really, really kind of remarkable thing. And during this time period, by the way, China has also lifted about 770 million people out of poverty, right? And so, like, it's just, education plus what the government has done. And we can have our quibbles about different systems, communism versus democracy, but China has very clearly sort of focused on education as a way to get people into, not just get them literate and out of poverty, but also get them into the higher education system such that they can build the industry. One of my favorite examples in the education world in the last 20 plus years is, Shanghai Jiao Tong University is an interesting university. It's not one of the Beijing top universities like Tsinghua and Beijing University, but it's probably in the top 5 of universities, and they're very proud of what they do. But 20 years ago, they launched a vocational technical education school because they realized that they shouldn't just be focusing education on students getting into universities like Shanghai Jiao Tong University, but instead they should also be focusing on training people so that they could go into the manufacturing supply chain. And so there's just a lot of examples like that. And so again, Russell sort of predicted all of these things, government, and the government was going to go through a lot of transitions. But then, if they get that right, and they get industry right, and they get education right, then the Chinese culture will really kind of, deliver. And so it was a very interesting and powerful analysis. And so I'm so thankful that we talked about it today.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. And, we maybe there are records, but I would assume that it would be difficult to know who, if anyone, in the Chinese leadership at the time, especially, Deng Xiaoping, if he read this or was aware
Yeah,
of it in his, travels and studies. And I think it's fascinating. And I also love the idea of a young person kind of debating these ideas, or the idea of how to grow the economy in China prior to having this leadership opportunity. And then once he came into power, he was able to execute these things that he was likely thinking about and planning
right,
for many years before he was able to enact them. And so I think that's I don't know, a lovely vision that I have of that young leadership watching. It's almost like watching your parents do everything wrong, right? And you're like, well,
right.
when I'm a parent, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and I'm going to be so much better. And so I really, I like that image of a young person learning and then able to enact the thing that they thought would work better than what was happening at the time. So yeah, this is a really fun conversation, Doug. I appreciate your time. And as you know, the world is continually shifting. And I think next week we'll likely have some updates
Yeah,
on things that have happened or will happen. And would love to continue the conversation next week.
I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it, Aubrey. Thank you so much for this. And I really enjoy talking to you every time.